In June 2025, one of the largest rescue operations in the history of Indonesia will unfold on the slopes of the country's second highest volcano. A 26-year-old Brazilian woman will find herself trapped 2,000 feet below the surface of the Rinjani crater, where every minute could be her last. When standard rescue methods prove ineffective, and international media broadcast the operation live, rescue services will invent a new descent technique that will go down in the history books. But the main tragedy of this story is not what happens on the slopes of the volcano, but what will become known after 4 days of heroic struggle. In June, the island of Lombok lives a quiet life during the dry season. Towering above all the splendor is Mount Rinjani, a 12,200-foot ancient volcano that hundreds of tourists climb every day. On June 20th, 2025, at the Sembilan base camp, a young woman in a bright red jacket stood out among 6 foreign tourists. She laughed at the guide's jokes, photographed the scenery, and radiated an energy that made others smile. Her name was Juliana Marines, and 48 hours later, her name would be known to millions of people around the world. Juliana de Souza Pereira Marines was what Brazilians call a person of the road. At 26, she worked as a publicist in Niterói, a city across the bay from Rio de Janeiro, but she lived for dancing. In the evenings, she would swap her office suits for salsa and bachata dresses. Dancing was not just a hobby, but a way of expressing the restless energy that kept her going. Restless in spirit, but in a good way, is how her sister Mariana described Juliana. This restlessness drove her to save money not for an apartment or a car, but for a dream with specific coordinates in Southeast Asia, a place where every dollar turns into a week of adventure, where you can discover a new world every morning. February 2025 became the starting point. Juliana boarded a plane at Galeen Airport with a backpack on her shoulders and a 6-month travel plan. Thailand greeted her with the chaos of Bangkok and the serenity of the islands. Vietnam offered motorcycle ballet and mountain trails in the north. The Philippines had underwater coral gardens. Every photo on her Instagram was a window into a life full of discoveries. By June, she had reached Indonesia, a country of 17,000 islands where volcanoes neighbor beaches. Juliana was the kind of traveler who sought challenges, moments when her heart beat faster with excitement and slight fear at the same time. 4 months of traveling had toughened her physically, and years of dancing had given her coordination and endurance. She was in the best shape of her life. The island of Lombok turned out to be the perfect choice. Less hyped than neighboring Bali, but no less beautiful. Rising above the island, Mount Rinjani beckoned like a magnet, Indonesia's second highest peak, and an active volcano with a crater lake inside. The climb was considered difficult but doable for a prepared tourist. Thousands of people climbed to the summit every year, and local guides knew the route by heart. The travel company chosen by Julia offered a standard 2-day itinerary: an ascent to a high-altitude camp on the first day, an overnight stay, and then an early morning assault on the summit on the second day. The group consisted of 6 foreign tourists and an experienced local guide, Ali Mustafa, who had been leading climbs for several years. On June 20th, the weather was perfect. It was the middle of the dry season, the temperature was comfortable, and the forecast promised clear days. At the base camp in Sembilan, Juliana immediately stood out with her cheerful disposition. She photographed everything from the process of packing her backpack to panoramic views of the volcano slopes, shared her plans with other participants, and joked with the guide. The route began through the tropical forests of the lower slopes. Lush greenery, birdsong, monkeys in the treetops, a classic Indonesian landscape. The group moved at a comfortable pace, stopping regularly to rest and take photos. By evening, they reached the high-altitude camp. They pitched their tents on a flat area with a view of the starry sky. Dinner was cooked on stoves, hot tea was drunk, and plans for the next day were discussed. Juliana felt great, not the slightest sign of fatigue. Tomorrow would be the final push to the summit. meeting the sunrise over the crater, and taking photos she would be proud of for the rest of her life. All the members of the group went to bed with anticipation. The weather remained stable, the mood was high, and confidence was complete. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. At 2 a.m. on June 21st, the camp woke up to the sound of alarm clocks. The final assault on the summit always begins in the dark. You have to climb before dawn, meet the sun over the crater, and descend before the midday heat. The temperature dropped to 42.8 degrees, and the humidity from the night fog made the air piercingly cold. The group members pulled on warm jackets, checked their flashlights, and drank hot coffee from thermoses. The last section of the route was considered the most difficult, a climb up loose volcanic gravel, where every step forward was half a step back. A narrow path led along the edge of the crater. To the right was a steep slope. To the left, a precipice hundreds of feet deep. In the darkness, the fog hid these dangers, limiting visibility to a few feet. The group formed a chain behind the guide's flashlight. Juliana walked at the rear, as is customary for less experienced participants. The first 2 hours of the climb went smoothly. Everyone was breathing heavily. The air at 9,800 feet contains 30% less oxygen, but the group moved steadily. At around 6:30 a.m., with less than half a mile to go to the summit, Juliana began to fall behind. At first, the gap was about 50 feet, then more. She stopped more often and breathed harder. These were classic symptoms of altitude sickness or accumulated fatigue. Guide Ali Mustafa returned to the straggler. He said he advised her to rest for a few minutes and then moved ahead to the group. When Mustafa returned to where he had left Juliana, the trail was empty. At first, he thought she had caught up with the group by another route, but the cries in response to his call made him look down. The faint light of a flashlight flickered somewhere deep in the crater, and a barely discernible voice calling for help came from the gray void. Juliana had fallen. It was impossible to reconstruct the exact circumstances of the fall. Juliana was alone in the pre-dawn fog. But the scene told its own story. The trail ran along the very edge of the cliff, with a safe passage no more than 5 feet wide. The volcanic rubble underfoot, drenched with night dew and morning fog, was as slippery as ice. Only Juliana herself knew what happened in those fateful seconds. Perhaps it was slight dizziness from altitude sickness. Perhaps she had misplaced her foot on a wet rock. Perhaps she had tried to take a quick step to catch up with the group that had gone ahead. At such a height, with limited visibility, and on a slippery surface, any mistake could be fatal. The crater slope was not vertical. It had a 60-degree angle. This meant not a free fall, but a rapid slide down loose volcanic rock. 1,000 feet down through sharp rocks, crumbling rubble and stone ledges. Somehow, Juliana survived the fall. Stopping on a narrow ledge among the rocks, she was able to call out. Weak but distinct cries for help echoed across the crater, and it was these cries that were heard by the guide, who had returned to the place where he had left her to rest. Other tourists, hearing the guide's cries and the responses from deep within the crater, rushed to the scene. One of them, a Spaniard with a drone, made a decision that would prove crucial to the entire operation. His quadcopter rose into the air and began its descent into the crater, guided by faint sounds from below. What the drone footage showed instilled hope and horror at the same time. At a depth of about 1,000 feet, on a narrow ledge among gray rocks, lay a figure in a red jacket. Juliana was moving, raising her arm, turning her head, trying to change her position. She was alive, but trapped, unable to escape on her own. The scale of the problem became immediately apparent. 1,000 feet vertically. A steep slope with a 60-degree angle. Loose volcanic rock that crumbled at the slightest touch. Fog limiting visibility. And a person below, losing strength with every passing minute from injuries and cold. Guide Mustafa immediately contacted the base camp by radio, relaying the coordinates and nature of the incident. The first message to Basarnas was sent at around 7 a.m., less than half an hour after the fall. But even then, it was clear that this was no ordinary emergency that could be resolved using standard methods. The group members watched the drone footage and realized that there was no way they could help. The first rescue team arrived at the scene at around 10 a.m. It consisted of 4 Basarnas rescuers with climbing equipment, 2 local rangers, and a medic. The standard equipment for high-altitude rescue includes 160 and 320-foot ropes, safety systems, and hooks for anchoring. The operation was led by Mohammed Shafi, a veteran with 15 years of rescue experience. At 43, he had led dozens of operations in the mountains of eastern Indonesia. But when he looked into the abyss, he realized he had never seen anything like it before. The 1,000-foot descent required at least 4 connected ropes, multiple intermediate safety points, and perfectly stable ground. The volcanic rubble of Rinjani was the complete opposite of stable. 22-year-old rescuer Ahmad Rizki volunteered for the most dangerous parts of the descent. His experience working on volcanic slopes was invaluable. The first attempt began at 11 a.m. Rizki and his partner tied together 320-foot ropes and began their descent, setting up intermediate anchors every 50 feet. But half of the hooks simply fell out under the load. The loose soil would not hold the metal, and any sudden movement caused rock falls. At a depth of 230 feet, the team stopped. It was simply too dangerous to continue. The slope was becoming steeper and the rock more unstable. Rizki shouted down, and Juliana answered. Her voice was weaker than it had been in the morning, but she was still conscious. She had 720 feet of virtually inaccessible descent left to go. By noon, the fog had thickened. Visibility dropped to 32 feet, making drone work impossible. The wind picked up to 25 Italian par, creating an additional threat. At 3 p.m., a second attempt was made from the other side of the slope, but the result was even worse. Juliana's voice was last heard at around 6:12 p.m. After that, only silence answered the rescuers' cries. By evening, it was clear that standard rescue methods were powerless. A technical revolution was needed, or they would lose the person they could see and hear but could not reach. June 22nd, 6 a.m. At the Sembilan base camp, an operations headquarters unlike anything Lombok has ever seen is being set up. Mohammed Shafi studies topographical maps of the crater and realizes that standard protocols are useless here. An engineering revolution in rescue operations is needed. Resources are being brought in from all over eastern Indonesia. Teams of rescue climbers, volcano experts, drones with thermal imaging cameras, military logistics. Local rangers provide maps of the slope's features. Shafi develops a step-by-step descent plan with intermediate bases every 165 feet. Each level has a rest area and equipment storage. Instead of the usual hooks, special bolts capable of withstanding enormous loads are screwed into the rock. Ahmad Rizki studies the plan and voluntarily takes on the most dangerous sections. For him, this is not just a job. At the age of 15, he lost his older brother in a landslide on Flores. Rescuers arrived too late. When he joined Basarnas, Rizki made a vow: "We don't leave people in the mountains." Now those words have taken on a personal meaning. By noon on June 22nd, the system is ready to be tested. Each foot of descent takes 40 minutes. Rizki calculates every move, coordinating with his team. The loose rock could collapse at any moment, dragging the person on the rope with it. At an altitude of 10,000 feet, the wind swings the climbers like pendulums, but Rizki descends foot by foot, creating a path for the teams behind him. The drones work continuously. Thermal imaging confirms that Juliana is still showing signs of life. Weak, but stable. This adds urgency to the operation and justifies the risks taken by the rescuers. On June 22nd, while Rizki was creating a new descent system, an information avalanche began in Brazil. Mariana Marines, Juliana's sister, created an Instagram account to coordinate information about the rescue operation. In 2 days, the number of followers grew from 0 to 1.5 million. The hashtag #SharkRescueJuliana went viral, spreading from Portuguese to other languages. Every update from the scene garnered hundreds of thousands of views. Brazilian TV channels began round-the-clock broadcasts. International media sent correspondents to Lombok. On June 23, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva personally calls the embassy in Jakarta, demanding reports on the progress of the operation. A group of deputies sends an official request to the Foreign Ministry, demanding that diplomatic pressure on Indonesia be increased. Soccer player Alexandre Pato publicly offers to pay all the costs of the operation. The Indonesian authorities find themselves under enormous pressure. Additional resources are brought in: military helicopters to deliver equipment, specialists from other regions, and medical teams. The Minister of Forestry reports daily to the President on the progress of the operation. But international attention turns into a double-edged sword. Every move made by the rescuers is recorded by journalist drones, and every setback is discussed live on air. Teams begin working 20 hours a day, which increases the risk of mistakes due to fatigue. The rescue operation has turned into a global spectacle, with human lives at stake. On June 23rd, at around 2 p.m., a tragic event occurs. Drones record that the unstable slope of the crater has collapsed. Juliana has fallen even deeper and is now 1,600 feet from the edge. An additional fall of 650 feet over sharp rocks and loose soil makes survival virtually impossible. But for the rescue team, this means only one thing: the descent system must be completely redesigned for the new depth. Siafi and Rizky understand that the chances are almost zero, but professional ethics do not allow them to stop. The evening of June 23rd becomes a turning point in the operation. The rescuers have created a descent system to a depth of 1,150 feet, an impressive technical achievement, but there are still 500 feet of the most dangerous slope to go before they reach Juliana, at a depth of 1,600 feet, and the drones have not detected any movement for 4 hours. A debate erupts at the operation headquarters that goes far beyond technical issues. Young rescuers insist on continuing the descent at any cost, but the experienced ones understand the reality of the situation. Siafi finds himself caught between two fires. On the one hand, there is international pressure to continue the operation, with millions of people watching every step. On the other hand, there is professional responsibility for the lives of his people. Every descent into the last 500 feet is practically a suicide mission. Ahmad Rizky once again voluntarily agrees to make the final descent. The most difficult moment comes at 11:30 p.m. The rescuers realize that even if they reach Juliana, there is almost no chance of finding her alive. Everyone understands the truth, but no one is ready to say it out loud. Soon, information came in via a secure communication channel from the operations medical consultant. The conclusion was grim. A person with injuries sustained in a fall from a height of 1,000 feet cannot survive more than 72 hours at a temperature of 42.8 degrees Celsius without medical assistance. At that point, 65 hours had already passed. Siafi made a decision that changed the nature of the operation. Officially, it continued as a rescue mission, but in reality, it became a recovery operation. The family was not informed of this. The international pressure was too great, and too many people were watching every move. The new goal required a different motivation from the rescuers. Now they were risking their lives not to save a person, but so that a family could bury their daughter. For professional rescuers, this is no less important a mission. The principle of leaving no one behind in the mountains applies even after death. On the morning of June 24th, the political consequences of the tragedy became clear. President Lula issued a decree lifting the ban on state funding for the repatriation of citizens' bodies abroad. Indonesian authorities closed all routes to Rinjani, an unprecedented measure that would affect thousands of tourists. For the rescuers, the change of goal was an emotional reset. Now they were no longer in a hopeless race against time, but were performing a clear technical task: to recover a body from a depth of 1,600 feet. It was still deadly dangerous, but psychologically more bearable. Ahmad Rizky prepared for the final descent as if it were the most important mission of his life. not for the sake of rescue, but for the sake of human dignity, so that a girl who dreamed of the beauty of the world could return home. The dawn of June 24th greeted the crater of Rinjani with the same gray silence. Fog clung to the crater walls. The wind whistled between the rocks, and the temperature hovered at 42.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Nature remained indifferent to the human drama. The drones took to the air at 5:30 a.m. Thermal imaging cameras scanned a familiar spot 600 feet below. The screens showed a static image, a motionless figure in a red jacket. No movement, no heat anomalies. Ahmad Rizki began the final descent at 6:00 a.m. In 4 days, Shafia's team had created an engineering marvel, a system of intermediate anchors that allowed them to descend safely to a previously inaccessible depth. The bolts in the rock had been checked repeatedly. The ropes were capable of withstanding the weight of a truck. Safety systems with triple redundancy. The last section was the most dangerous. The slope became almost vertical and the rock even looser. Every movement Rizki made caused a rockfall. Rocks the size of fists whistled past his head, crashing into the lower ledges. At 8:15 a.m., the rescuer hung on the rope 9 feet from the motionless figure. Juliana lay peacefully, as if asleep, but her posture indicated that death had come instantly. Rizki radioed official confirmation. No signs of life detected. There was silence on the radio for several seconds. Everyone involved in the operation knew they would hear those words, but the reality hit hard. Mohammed Shiafi reported that the rescue phase of the operation was complete at 8:25 a.m. The evacuation of the body began, a task that was technically no less difficult. By 2:30 p.m., the stretcher carrying Juliana's body reached the top of the crater. The rescuers stood in silence, not in celebration of victory, but out of respect for a person who sought the beauty of the world and paid for it with her life. Weather conditions prevented the use of a helicopter. The same fog and wind that had hampered the operation for 4 days forced the body to be carried down on foot. 4 rescuers took the stretcher on their shoulders and began the 8-hour descent to the Sembilan base camp along narrow mountain paths. At 10:40 p.m. on June 24th, the stretcher reached base camp. The physical part of the operation was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. The body was taken to the Bayankara Police Hospital in Mataram for an autopsy in preparation for repatriation. On June 27th, an autopsy performed at Bali Mandara Hospital confirmed what experienced rescuers had intuitively understood. Juliana died from blunt force trauma and internal bleeding within 30 minutes of her fall on June 21st. There was no hypothermia or dehydration. Death was rapid due to injuries sustained from hitting rocks. The family has put forward several theories about what happened. The first is that the Indonesian authorities are hiding the truth about the time of death to justify the slow rescue operation. The second is that the autopsy was poorly conducted or the results were falsified. The family demanded a second autopsy in Brazil, but by that time the body had already been repatriated and buried. On July 1st, East Lombok police questioned guide Ali Mustafa and 3 other witnesses. Mustafa insisted on his version of events. He left for 3 minutes, returned, and discovered the tourist missing. The family demanded that he be held accountable for negligence, claiming that he left Juliana alone for more than an hour. Juliana's father, Manuel Marins, told Brazilian media, "If the guide had done his job and stayed with my daughter, she would be alive." The contradiction between the drone footage and the autopsy results sparked multiple theories. Experts suggested that the movements could have been caused by wind blowing the clothes or technical errors in the thermal imaging cameras. The family insisted that either the drone footage or the autopsy had been falsified. Brazilian lawmakers demanded an international investigation, and the Federal Public Defender's Office considered filing a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The family felt betrayed. 4 days of hope, millions of Instagram followers, international attention, and all the while their daughter was already dead. The investigation is still ongoing, but no charges have been filed yet. Indonesian authorities insist that everything possible was done under extreme conditions, and the contradiction in the data remains unexplained. The tragic irony was obvious to everyone involved in the operation. 4 days of technically flawless work were doomed to failure from the start. But the rescue operation on Rinjani will soon be included in textbooks as an example of technical perfection in extreme conditions. The system of staged descent with intermediate anchors developed by Siafia's team became the standard for working in volcanic areas. Ahmad Rizki was awarded the highest service award for bravery. In an interview, he said, "We knew we were late, but it was our duty not to leave people in the mountains, dead or alive. Juliana deserved to return home with dignity." The political consequences were far-reaching. President Lula not only issued a decree changing the repatriation law, but also instructed the foreign ministry to develop new protocols for supporting citizens abroad. Indonesia invested in upgrading rescue equipment and closed the routes to Rinjani for 3 months to review safety measures. On July 4, 2025, Juliana Marines was buried in Niterói, Brazil, in the presence of thousands of people. President Lula personally expressed his condolences to the family. The mayor of the city declared a day of mourning. The girl who dreamed of the beauty of the world united 2 continents in grief and forever changed safety protocols in both countries. But the main question remains unanswered. What exactly happened in those fateful 3 minutes alone with the fog?